And at this time, we're going to call up Dr. Virgie Cantorna to deliver our special talk today, The Power of Grief.
Aloha, everybody. Okay. Everybody, take a deep breath. And breathe out. And breathe in. And breathe out. Reverend Blaine asked me to talk about the power of grief. And I think he was concerned about all of the emotion that comes with and came with our time of coronavirus. And so I told him I'd be happy to talk about that. I see grief almost every day in my work as a clinical psychologist. Grief is a human experience, and it's a very powerful tool for healing, and it's a facilitator for human connection. And so everybody here has experienced grief. And so when we remind ourselves of that, we can also remind ourselves to look at the person outside of you, the individual that's facing you, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Because we all have been through some sort of sadness and loss. Sometimes grief is collective, and I'm sure that we all remember 9/11. I was in graduate school. It was my second day of school. And I received a call from my sister, and she said, "It's World War III, turn on the television." So I turned on the television, and there are those very graphic videos about the planes that flew into the World Trade Center. And I remember being stuck in Honolulu. There were no flights in or out. My father-in-law, Al's dad, had passed away. I think it was the week before, and we were planning services for that week, and we weren't sure I could even attend those services. And so the entire school was shut down, and I know that my classmates and I and the faculty were grieving. And in fact, we had faculty members who knew people, who had friends who worked in the Trade Center, World Trade Center. Another time of collective grief was the Challenger explosion. I remember that I was in a classroom and we were waiting for the broadcast, and it was delayed in Hawaii. But when they showed the explosion, because we had an astronaut from Hawaii on board, it was especially sad. And then for me, the loss of Diana, Princess Diana, was a big thing because my father had passed around the time that she had passed. And so it was a double grief. And more recently, we have the George Floyd incident. There was a lot of anger around that, but anger is part of grieving. Anger is a stage of grieving. And then we have the wildfires all up and down the West Coast. And I can't remember her name right now, but we had a singer and pianist who would come to Unity Church and sing. Do you remember Kurt? Kathy Zavada, she lost her home and all of her recordings and all of her original music to the fire. And so there was grief around that. And then in Hawaii, the Mauna Kea movement, there was grief around that. And I remember seeing a lot of marches and flags flying upside down, signifying distress. And most recently, we lost our beloved Reverend Mary Omwake. And I remember that we had a big gathering here to honor her life. I was asked to give a talk, and I couldn't help myself. I just sobbed. Had the ugly cries on television. But it was a grief that we shared. So we had this human connection, and it was powerful for healing. Grief signifies some kind of loss, and so that means that there has been a change or a transformation, even a positive transformation. It might mean that you're stuck or in limbo. It might mean a loss in terms of injustice or a loss in terms of distance. My best friend is visiting from San Francisco, and because there's distance between us, there's some sadness there. And so when she comes to visit, there's a lot of joy and connection. And then there's letting go. There's some things that we have to let go. There's a spectrum of grief. Grief can be, or loss can be obvious, or loss can be very subtle. The obvious ones are loss of life to death. Divorce is another one, the breakup of a relationship, the loss of a job, financial instability, the loss of a home, and the loss of health. For me, I'm beginning to grieve loss of health. And I find that a lot of people in my age group, I'm 65, are feeling some loss. Some people never find romantic love, so they feel very lonely and are grieving that. The ability to have children is a loss. Declining mental capacity. I see a lot of patients whose relatives, whose mother or father are suffering from Alzheimer's or some sort of dementia, and that definitely is a loss, particularly if their loved one can't recognize them anymore. My own uncle was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he's rapidly declining, and it's sad. There's a loss of social connection. There's loneliness, loss of our dreams, loss of a pet, and even the very positive, happy occasions like a graduation. There's grief enfolded into that. You're sad that you'll never see all of your classmates in the same place again, even though it is exciting that you have graduated and are moving forward. I had planned to show slides on the video, but there's a slide here of me in a play. I've been in plays every summer for, I think, 8 years now. And the last play I was in was Into the Woods. And I had a solo. And then coronavirus hit. And there were no more plays. There was no more choir practice. There's no more singing. No more acting. No more being in a orchestra. It was a great loss. It is a great loss, although it's coming back now. And about 97% of performance arts got shut down. Not just actors and musicians, but all of the support people the costumiers, the set designers and set builders and lighting people. They're all out of jobs and suffering. And then there's the loss of just the arts, which is, to me, the soul, people's soul, where we can express emotion and sadness through poetry and through song and music and being on stage and films. So there was that loss. There is predictable versus subtle loss. Predictable losses allow time for you to prepare. So my father died in 1996, and he had a heart attack. We flew him to Honolulu, and in about a week, we had to decide whether to take him off life support. But we had a week to prepare for his transition. And then 10 years after that, my mother had a stroke, and we were told if you're without oxygen for 2 minutes, you die. If you're without water for 2 days, you could die. And if you're without food for 2 weeks, you could die. And she couldn't swallow, and she had refused food, so we knew that she was going to be making her transition. And we had time. We had 2 weeks to prepare and to let her know that we loved her and just share memories and sing and all of that. And then there's the other side of knowing that someone is going to be making their transition, and that's called anticipatory grief. That means you're grieving even before the death or the loss has occurred. And I have a lot of patients who are experiencing anticipatory grief. You're sad already before the event actually happens. And then I think the most shocking of all is sudden death, the unexpected changes through crime or accidents or suicides. They're traumatic, and there's no way to prepare for these losses, and it jars your sense of security and your confidence in the predictability of life. And in 2019, on June 29, we lost my Hanai brother to a drowning. It was the day before his 45th birthday, and I'll never forget receiving the call from my sister, and she was screaming on the end of the line. That was such a huge loss. We had been planning a big birthday party for him. It was so tragic because he was a skilled fisherman, and he knew how to swim, and he was not afraid of the waters. But on this day, the ocean was very rough, and the story that's told is that he tried to rescue 2 children, and in the process, the children were saved and he drowned. And then several months after that, my nephew, who was 29 years old, he showed up at our hospital and asked to be admitted. He had been suicidal, and he was suffering from mental illness and had just completed a drug rehab program. And the hospital turned him away 3 times in 24 hours. They actually escorted him out of the emergency room, and we were in shock because when people show up to the emergency room and they're unable to speak, the nurses and the doctors, of course, would assume a heart attack or a stroke, and they would admit him immediately. But because my nephew was a psychiatric patient, and probably they assumed that he was on drugs. They refused him care. And so what happened was he completed a suicide on the hospital grounds. And that was very, very, very shocking. So I'm sure that all of you have had some kind of loss and have experienced some kind of grief, although maybe not as traumatic as the ones that I described to you. But the reactions of the grief reactions that are normal, you think they're not normal, but they really are normal. And I want you to know that sometimes you'll feel as if you're crazy. You might have difficulty concentrating. You might feel sad or depressed, irritable or angry. Especially, you might be angry at the person who died, or at yourself, or even angry at God. You might feel misunderstood, experience anxiety, nervousness, or fearfulness. You might feel like you want to escape, just go to sleep, never want to go to work again. You might feel guilt or remorse, feel ambivalent, lack energy and motivation, feel numb, and be tearful. And grief is more than sadness. Grief is more than a time frame. There's no time frame for grief. Grief has its own itinerary. It has its own power over you. And grief will come when it comes. Grief will subside, and then all of a sudden, a holiday will come up, or a song will be played, or you'll smell a particular scent, and then grief bubbles up again. What I tell my patients is that grief is like the ocean. In the beginning, it feels like a tsunami. The waves are intense, and they come rapidly, and they're pounding over you over and over and over again, just like a tsunami. And over time, the waves relax, they become gentler and further between. But there will always be an ocean, and sometimes the ocean will be very calm, and you can laugh again and play again and relax and create again, and then something will come up. And again, a tsunami will occur. And you have to go through grief to start to heal. Everyone's experience of grief is unique. Very recently, I was referred a patient who cried every single day, not just the tears rolling down, sobbing cries, every single day for 5 years. And her children were absolutely concerned about her reaction to the loss of her husband. And when I interviewed her, she said that they were soulmates. She and her husband were soulmates. And when she cried, she felt the closest to him. And so I told her it's okay to cry and it's okay to sob. Even if it is 5 years, if that's when you feel the closest to him, go ahead and do it. And I told her to set up an altar with his photo and some mementos of him. Bring in some flowers, light a candle, and she lit up. And so some people will grieve just a short time. Maybe it's a month, and people will make judgments like, oh, you didn't give it a full year. Well, some people grieve for a month, and then they find a new love, And what's wrong with that? You find a new love. Life is short. Go with the love, right? And some people will grieve for a very, very long time. I once had a mother, and she was grieving for over a year for her daughter who completed a suicide. And she would carry this teddy bear around with her. And of course, there was judgment. Why are you carrying that teddy bear? Well, this teddy bear belonged to my daughter, and I just want to feel close to her. And again, I normalized that. That's okay. There's no problem with that. Grief is not something to be ashamed of. Grief gets treated like an unwanted, unwelcome visitor because we don't know what to do or say in its presence. It is so heavy, so forceful, so felt. It cuts through words and silence all the time. We haven't been taught how to respond to it without feeling a sense of dread or awkwardness and without shrinking. Grief is a part of me and it's a part of us. It's not shameful. It's not an intolerable part, but perhaps the most tender human part. To grieve is to be vulnerable. To grieve is to feel completely exposed. It demands strength and courage, even more so in the presence of others. Nothing can shake you to your core without your consent. I want you to know that you can rise from the bottom of the ocean, swim your way to the top, and take a breath once again. Grief demands so much from us: surrender, patience, courage, and trust. Trusting that leaning into your grief and surrendering control will not kill you. Sometimes there are people who are so afraid of crying, of letting go, trusting that you will move through your grief and move with your grief. On the other side of grief is peacefulness. If you just work through it, there's peacefulness and empowerment and love and audacity, creativity and strength, resilience, kindness, and determination. Feeling the depth and immensity of our emotions may be the one thing that can catalyze us to make impactful changes for ourselves and for each other and for future generations. And so a lot of times our grief, the energy that we find in grief, is translated into art. And so oftentimes it's in poetry or songs. Oftentimes it's in art. And so I'm wondering if you are familiar with the art called the Scream. There's a figure, and his hands are here and his mouth is open. And then there's a blue painting by Picasso called The Old Guitarist. And that was created when Picasso was sad. And then there's a self-portrait by Van Gogh with his ear cut off. And then there's one called Broken Column by Frida Kahlo that shows nails and staples in her torso because of all the pain that she was experiencing. And so why does coronavirus cause sadness? You fear that you or your loved ones will get COVID-19. When I first was hearing about COVID-19, I actually cried. I went through the list of my relatives and I thought, oh my God, which one of us is going to die from coronavirus? You have no chance to be with and comforted by your loved one if they are seriously ill or dying in the hospital. And I was in the hospital during the time of coronavirus, and I was not allowed any visitors. And thank goodness my daughter Emily was an RN, and she was the only one who could visit me. There's grief over the loss of a loved one to COVID-19. And in my family, we lost my grandnephew. He was age 14 to COVID-19 because he was at risk because of asthma. There is postponement and cancellation or changes in significant events like weddings and funerals. And we did have a death in our extended family during the time of coronavirus. And there were only 10 people who could be at the funeral, and 3 of those were the mortuary workers. So the rest of us had to stand on the side of the road and watch. And so there's a lot of things that can cause sadness during the time of coronavirus. I noticed that the numbers of patients who were depressed and anxious increased. And it brings to mind, or I tend to think of Jesus. And Jesus, I believe, really understood human suffering and grief. You know, what comes to my mind is the story of Lazarus and that he wept. And that he wept at Gethsemane. And that he was sorrowful at the loss of John. In Isaiah 43:2, it is said, "When you go through deep waters, I will be with you." And so what can you do to pull yourself out of grief and be empowered? You can find a cause. So after my nephew's death, my sister set up a foundation called Casey's Project, the Casey Project, with the purpose of teaching about suicide prevention. And I was counseling my patients, find a project that you can get behind, and at the end of coronavirus, you'll have something that you can say you're proud of having finished. And then I thought, well, geez, Virgie, if you're giving out this advice, you better follow it yourself. And so I decided to write a book, and I'm happy to say that it got published in May. And so what I would like you to do is, oh, thank you. The best ad is to think about the losses that you have experienced and how can you come out to the other end of that. Even though some of these losses may have been from long ago, of course, you still feel the energy and the loss. What good can come out of it? I want you to think of that. What good can come out of that? Would it be something self-improvement? Would it be designing some kind of legacy project? Just being kind to another person? Just having an understanding of another person's grief? And so I wish you a lot of peace and love because we're in this together. Thank you. Bow your heads and take in a deep breath and release. Breathe in and release. And I'd like you to bring to mind any of the losses that you have experienced and just bless them. Bless these experiences Know that you're the stronger for it, that you're not alone, that there is peace and hope and love and courage in this world. And ask for strength and ask for courage. For resilience, for hope and faith. Know that all of these qualities are already inside of you and surround you. Know that you are strong and confident, and that you are connected with your loved ones, and that God is with you at all times. Take in a deep breath and release. And one more deep breath and release. Without clouds, the rain can't wash the land. Without rain, the grass won't hide the sand. Without grass, the flowers bloom won't grow. Without pain, the joy in life won't show. Never saw a sunrise that didn't follow night. Hardly saw it shining till a shadow blocked its light. Never took a journey and not leave some place behind. Not feel some anguish before some peace of mind. Without clouds, the rain can't wash the land. Without rain, the grass won't hide the sand. Without grass, the flowers bloom won't grow. Without pain, the joy in life won't show. I'm not afraid of pain or threats it seems to give, though it only tears at life with little left to live. Still it won't conquer me if I can learn to bend, for when its course is run, renewed I'll rise again. Without clouds, the rain can't wash the land. Without rain, the grass won't hide the sand. Without grass, the flowers bloom won't grow. Without pain, the joy in life won't show. There's one who knew our pain. There's one who felt our loss. And yet he knew a love that went beyond the cost. He dared to lose it all, to trust the Father's care, and God restored his life and conquered death's despair. Without clouds, The rain can't wash the land without rain. The grass won't hide the sand without grass. The flowers bloom won't grow without pain. The joy in life won't show without pain. The joy in life won't show.
Beautiful, beautiful. My heart was overwhelmed. Let's give Dr. Virgie Cantorna another hand. I was crying the whole time. The whole time. How many of you have felt grief? Gone through all of the things that Dr. Virgie talked about? And I want to thank you because I've processed and gone through and processed and gone through, and it's like you said, it's that ocean. But what I am so grateful for is the joy. Is that in the midst of it all, acknowledging it, living with it, and finding the joy. And so thank you for that. Beautiful. I'm sorry, my heart is full. Brother Kurt, thank you so much for your accompaniment. Just beautiful, beautiful.
Where I live, there are rain.